Sure.
Nadia, you good to start?
I think so, yeah.
All right, everyone. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I think we'd like to start now. Welcome to the Queer Arab Imaginary panel. My name is Nadia Awad, and I am the moderator for this panel. I'd like to introduce the panelists, and I'll start in the order that they'll be speaking. On my right, is Nadia Awad. Nadia Awad is a filmmaker and artist based in Brooklyn. Last year, she accompanied the first LGBT delegation to Palestine, and she's currently working and preparing a film on that visit. In the middle is Bashar Makhay, and Bashar began his organizing work with Access, the Arab Community Center for Economic and Social Services, as an HIV/AIDS counselor, serving at-risk Arab and Chaldean MSM, men who have sex with men, populations. Recognizing a need for broader services, Bashar co-founded Al-Gamia, the GLBT Association of Middle Eastern Americans that provide opportunities for socialization, support, education, and awareness for the GLBT Middle Eastern community in Detroit. Most recently, Bashar worked as a program associate for the Arcus Foundation, a private foundation that works to achieve equality on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. He was a member of the social justice team that coordinates grant making and develops investment strategies that remove barriers towards equality on the basis of race, gender, religion, homophobia, and transphobia. On my right is Trish Saleh, and Trish Saleh is a lecturer at the Ontario Institute for Studies of Education. Her current research concerns the emergence of transgender literature. Her poetry includes Wanting in Arabic from 2002 and Lyric Sexology 2014. Welcome.
Hi, I'm just going to make sure that it should be popping up shortly. Can I have if there's a hand with this, just to, do we have a?
You need a tech person?
Yeah, I mean, it's plugged in, so it should be popping up, so.
There's also 3 seats up here for anybody who's on the floor wants to come up. There's 1 here and 2 here, and another one by the softboard here.
Just
4 seats.
I think you need to turn off and then turn on.
And 5 and
Turn off and then turn on?
Yeah.
Oh, this?
Yeah, but you know what? He's the...
Hi. So this is plugged in, so it should pop up here. Do you need to turn the monitor on?
Sure. Because it's connected to the live stream right now.
Okay.
So do you have that video? Do you know that?
Hold on. No, but hold on 1 sec. Hold on 1 second. My understanding is that it would just like pop up.
There might be like a switch.
Sorry about that. I thought it was just gonna work.
So when I'm going to use this.
Yeah, it's almost here.
Shouldn't be the opposite.
Want to go to the next one?
Shouldn't it go from the computer?
You go out and see if my invite box is there.
I don't know if that's no, that's just going to the monitor.
Is this supposed to work? I can also do it without these images. Just talk. Just want them. Yeah, it would be wonderful.
Do you want us to start or can we restart your computer and see if that works? Okay. Sometimes that doesn't.
Wait.
Oh, so we shouldn't turn it off?
Not yet.
Okay.
Oh, it was the wrong thing.
We'll try this. I have no idea.
That should work, at least for this.
Yeah, the question is, does it go out on the live stream?
Probably not. Well, they have it on the webcam. They have it on the webcam.
Yeah. Boom.
Yay!
All right. I'm going to check the live stream. If not, we'll figure it out. I'll announce something on Twitter. Good luck.
Oh yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
ready, Nadia. Go ahead.
Okay.
I think we're gonna start now.
All right, sorry about that. We just had the wrong thing plugged in. So I'm going to be talking about documentary work as activism in the Palestinian context, but I first wanted to talk a little bit about the broader context that Palestinian filmmakers operate in. So I wanted to go back to 1895, actually, and this film here, which is the first. I'm just going to show it and show it and talk to you. If it's going to let me show it. Hold on a sec. Let's try it this way. Okay. So, and I believe it was an eight. Okay.
Yeah.
So, in 1894, the Lumiere brothers invented the first moving image camera. And this was shot in 1895, the following year. The French government sent them to Egypt to start filming images of pyramids, Arabs, camels, these sorts of things. So the first images immediately after this technology was made were images of the Middle East. And immediately this new technology, and also this new art form, was turned into an industry and mobilized as a colonial technology immediately after it was created. So when we talk about film, we can talk about it as an art form, but we also have to acknowledge that it began right off the bat as something used for colonial ends. And the films that the Lumiere brothers did, they took a lot of films in factories. They were really obsessed with mechanization and how mechanized bodies looked. And they took a lot of films in the Arab world. There are a lot of short films of men smoking water pipes, belly dancers who may or may not be Arabs, following the legacy of Orientalist painting, which used European models to create a fantasy of the Middle East in order to justify colonialism and also sell the Arab world as a destination for wealthy people who wanted to, collect nice things, I guess. So that starts off there. I just want to go to the next thing. Let me just. Okay. Does anyone? I'm just going to keep it like this. Does that bother anyone? Just because I'm having a slide. No. Does anyone know where these either still is from? Which movies these stills are from?
The right one is Munich?
The right one is Munich. Good job. Exodus.
Well, it says right there.
Oh, it does. So you cheated. Well, that's good.
But I told you I did.
Well, that's good. All right, so Exodus and Munich, okay. So on the left, Exodus was made in 1960. It was the largest, one of the largest film productions. It told the story of the Jewish return to the homeland, right, starring Moses, or what is his name? Charleston? Paul Newman. So it was not Moses. I'm sorry about that. I'm getting my leaders mixed up. I'm sorry. Starring Paul Newman, actually, who supported, contributed money to Ten Commandments, but was linked to that project as well. But the reason this is significant is because Exodus sort of shaped the language around Israel and Palestine in the U.S. for time immemorial, for lack of a better phrase. Taha, the Arab on the left, is the first Palestinian that we see in Hollywood cinema. And he is a wandering Arab. He appreciates the Zionist. He goes out of his way to collaborate. All of his dialogue is, I'm so impressed with how literate all of you are. You're so superior. I just live in a desert. It's kind of ridiculous. And I think at the end he gets murdered, but I have to double check on that. Okay, so this is the first image that we see in Hollywood cinema of a Palestinian. Okay, and then the next image the first time we see a Palestinian, and also the first time and the only time for a couple decades where we have a Palestinian delivering like a monologue. Okay, and the next time that happens is in Munich, where one of the suspected terrorists that the protagonist in Munich is seeking out to kill delivers a monologue about how he wants to return to Palestine, and he fights for his homeland mostly out of vengeance because he feels wronged, not because he feels connected to the land. But between those two images, you have images of Palestinians sort of kind of barking in an Arabic-like language. You have them playing terrorist, but they essentially have no speaking roles between these two poles in Hollywood cinema. So this is really significant. So another thing that is interesting about this is that the way that these films are produced reproduces the geopolitical relationships that they attempt to articulate. So Exodus, a lot of money was raised from Hollywood liberals to produce Exodus, and raised from the JNF. They shot parts of it in Jordan. You're using American actors with a lot of star power and this sort of thing. And similarly with Munich, they hired consultants from the U.S. government, participated in going through the script to ensure that Munich was consistent with the American history on these events, which is something that gets repeated, especially when in military films, which the filmmakers have to submit their films to the Pentagon for clearance in order to use equipment. And in order to get a broader audience, or the film will not be distributed to army bases around the world, which usually is a deciding factor in whether a film will be successful or not. Okay, so these are the two images. Oops. And these are all films that have been produced. All of them have been produced post 9/11, except for Three Kings. And all of them were shown either at the White House, the CIA, or the State Department as a point of departure for policy meetings. So Three Kings is an action film which very few people have seen. Mark Wahlberg and Ice Cube are in it. Oh, you saw it? Oh, yeah. And the first 10 minutes of the film, the soldiers have kind of gone AWOL. They're in Iraq. They're tired of fighting, and they explode with all of these racial epithets against Arabs for about 10, 15 minutes. And then, they become the heroes in the end because they realize that the U.S. Army's good and whatever. So Clinton showed this film before meeting with Arab American organizations to discuss policy in Iraq and what to do about Iraqi refugees, which he had a population he had created because of his bombing of no-fly zones. So I just want to, in a sort of condensed, with a condensed history, just convey the point that these films function in the same way that a political speech might function, in the same way that a political document might function, and in the same way that expert testimony might function. Ben Affleck, who recently starred in Argo, which is a revisionist history of the Iran hostage crisis, had been meeting and giving presentations on his politics regarding whether we should bomb Iran for several years at the CIA and at the State Department before producing Argo. So there are these relationships. So it's important, although Hollywood produces films that are entertaining and that convey other kinds of messages and are some enjoyable to watch. They also have this real effect on the way policy is articulated and the way it's shaped in relation to the U.S. and the Arab world, and especially Palestine. So I just wanted to show these. So 1993 was a kind of a watershed both for policy and for camera technology. The first professional digital camera was created in 1993, so people could then shoot their own films without having to spend loads of money, without having to shoot film, which is extremely expensive. And also 1993 was the year of Oslo. So after you have these sort of two events happen, you have this whole slew of documentaries, of which these are three, that kind of reproduce this image of two sides coming together, parallel lives, parallel stories. And I recommend that you watch them. They're interesting films. Arna's Children was directed by the late Giuliano Merhamis. It's about his mother and the work that she did as an Israeli communist married to a Palestinian in the Jenin refugee camps. To Die in Jerusalem kind of uses a suicide bombing as a point of departure to look at both the victim's life and the suicide bomber's life. They were both 18 when they died. And again, pivots around this two sides, two stories. Both of them are suffering, sort of narrative and promises, which aired on PBS to much protest, even though it's about the lives of children living under occupation or living in settlements. Also kind of reproduces this, what I call like an Oslo period documentary theme. And then it's important to note, with the exception of Giuliano, whose father is Palestinian, I can't think of one documentary during this period that was produced by a Palestinian following this theme. So I just want to set that up. This is Jenin, which was another watershed. It contains the only footage that we have of the Jenin massacre, directed by Mohammed Bakri. He, again, going back to this idea of how film implicates policy, the Israeli army had the audacity to sue him for defamation of the soldiers who committed war crimes in this film. And I show this film because this was the first big film made by a Palestinian that shows this kind of atrocity. And it inspired a lot of these other films. These are Until When by Dana Abu Rahme, Children of Shatila by Maya Masri, and Port of Memory are all documentaries that talk about the Palestinian experience solely from everyday life of Palestinians. It doesn't engage in this both sides, what is the other half doing sort of dialogue, and it doesn't pretend to be responsible for other people's stereotypes. And I only have a few minutes, so these two films, Budros, I would characterize as more of an Oslo era, two sides sort of film. Five Broken Cameras, although it's a collaboration, I would not characterize it this way, and represents a new sort of avenue for Palestinian documentary film production. I recommend you see them together because they talk about exactly the same period, the same village, the same characters, and have a completely different narrative around what's actually happening. So I'm just going to skip over here. Beit Salem has given cameras to a lot of young Palestinians so that they're able to film things on the ground and are able to document human rights abuses, and the internet has helped sort of create an alternative and distribute an alternative documentary production from people who aren't necessarily trained. I'm just trying to convey there are different streams of documentary production in response to this sort of like military Hollywood machine that's producing a more imperialistic narrative. And last, I just wanted to talk a little bit about interactivity, which is a new field. It doesn't interactive documentaries don't commit to a particular narrative or particular space because they're online and it's up to the user to sort of navigate that, which creates a lot of interesting potential for Palestinians. This, attempts to show what was happening in 2008 for both places, Gaza and Sderot. But I know, having spoken to some of the filmmakers, that one of the things they struggled with is making the Israeli side seem that it was suffering as much as the Palestinian side. And it's evident when you watch a lot of the videos. So in the interactive, more open mode isn't really conducive to narratives that don't reflect what's happening. And this last one is on the refugee camp in Lebanon, Exile Without End. It was a Canadian, Lebanese, Palestinian production, and it goes through Shatila and the what has happened since 1982 when the IDF and the Phalange went in and committed an atrocity. I highly recommend it. It's really interesting. I had a 3-minute excerpt of my film to show, but I don't mind doing that at the end if that's more appropriate.
I'm cool.
Do you feel okay?
Yeah, you should show it.
So as she said in the bio, I'm sorry to kind of like rush through this, but as she said in the bio, I'm working on a film. Hopefully it will have an interactive component. I'm still doing post-production on the first Solidarity delegation to Palestine, and so I'll show a clip of it. Hold on one sec. Just see if I can find it. Let's see, excerpt. Okay. So this is, in keeping with the theme of translation and, I guess, and different contexts. These are 2 delegates going through the Deja refugee camp. Oops. Wait, hold on a sec. Sorry.
Is the audio cable?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Didn't realize sound isn't going through here.
Is it not going clear enough?
No, we needed the extra little thing.
Yeah, it should be. Sorry, I don't know this.
If everyone's really quiet, we should.
I don't know.
Is it loud on the audio?
Why don't we go get somebody? and
Okay.
we'll come back.
Okay, sorry about that. Sorry, I totally forgot about audio.
It should be usually attached to that.
Yeah, I know.
Sorry, I'm not very good back to it and that person.
Oh, no, it was my, I didn't think about it. So we just need a little, oh, that's it? Oh, sorry. Okay. Okay, let's see.
Nadia, you still have more time, so don't.
Okay. Oh,
There we
thank you. All right. So here we are. Okay.
Hello! And this is, it's alhamdulillah, it's imaging. It's a personal imaging from the Nadia Awad thing. What he think, because he sleep, he dream of some children dream to come back to
Palestine in a different
and he wake up and draw the children and named him Hamdallah.
And what does that mean?
I don't know.
But there's another.
Yes.
That's the great. And what is it?
ذهب الذين تحبهم فإما أن تكون ولا تكون. It's somebody who you are love. It's go.
Not getting it.
It's a symbol or a symbol for the
Letting go of something that you love?
Somebody is going, but you must exist here or not exist. Be careful.
Careful. So he lived here.
Yes, you know, it's I like this sentence. مكانك اليوم عند الديمقراطية عجبني كثير. I like your writings. Today you are writing about the democratic. What about you writing tomorrow? I'm back to وصيتي.
You're back to what?
I write يعني وصيتي. I write my sentence. It's before I die.
Oh,
yes.
Like my epitaph, like what
yes.
you, like what's written is the
yes.
last thing.
Yes, the last thing.
And this one, another one.
Yeah, it's from our.
Barbara, do you know this artist? Thank you. Thank you for saying hello to me. Nadia Awad. Wow, powerful.
Yes, Palestinian artist who was killed in London.
Oh no.
Yes.
When?
Salamat. When?
Recently?
Yes, I think so. And not recently, but in the I think so. 88. 1988. Yes. It's
Really
Palestine, our land. Palestine, our land. He is. And he is shouting, Palestine, our land. And he is sadness and thinking, Palestine, our land. And the children and another generation, the last generation is writing and shouting and talking, Palestine, our land.
I think is so great is that his strong.
Yes.
But he also everyone is drawn from the back. It was very interesting. Yes. Like I haven't seen any. Well, I just heard this thing. This is the closest thing to a frontal that he's done there. All of them. This is very right. I saw another one and famous.
Okay, sorry to make that short. Thank you.
All right, just get started, I guess. So, not a lot of media or pictures or anything to show you today, but when I was approached to speak at this panel, I wanted to talk about what I knew, which was organizing queer Arab communities, really looking at queer Arab and ethnic minorities, and I'm going to use the term SWANA, which is an acronym to mean Southwest Asia and North Africa, that are living in the diaspora, specifically the United States. So I guess I should start. My name is Bashar Makhay. I'm an LGBT organizer. I'm originally born and raised in Detroit. Identify as a gay, Chaldean, Iraqi, American, Catholic, liberal man, recognizing the privileges that I have also as a man. I have a history of organizing the queer Arab and Chaldean community in Detroit, and recently for the past year I've been organizing in New York City as a member of the Arab Queer Collective and as an organizer of a queer SWANA event called Thought of NYC, which I see a lot of faces that were at the reception yesterday, so it's great. I do want to say this is just going to focus on my experiences and my understanding of the history in those two communities, Detroit and New York City. But this is not an academic speech, nor does it attempt to try to be one. This is just from the heart and my experience. And I hope I don't oversimplify things because of the short period of time that we have here. But if you look at the United States, there are about 4 million people that identify as Arab or have heritage from Arab lands or are ethnic minorities from Southwest Asia and North Africa. And a large percentage of those are actually in the two cities that I've lived in, which is Detroit and New York City, about 400,000 in Detroit, 375,000 in New York City. And largely in Detroit, it's largely Iraqi and Lebanese, while New York City is a big mix from all over, the Levant, the Gulf, Egypt, and the Maghreb. And it's also interesting in the United States, religion is different, whereas in the Arab world, predominantly Muslim. Here in the United States, we're looking at 75% of the population being Christian and 25% being Muslim. So you got that. And then you have, the idea that there's 10% of the population is gay. Some people say that, that's not true. Other people say it's 4%. For my purposes, I'm just going to stick with 6 because I think that's a nice number. It's average. So that's just a conservative estimate, which also includes transgender people, which the 4% number doesn't. So of that would mean 240,000 queer Arabs and Swana minorities are queer. And, that would mean in Detroit, there's about 24,000 queer Arabs or Swana minorities, and then in New York City, about 22,000. So huge communities, but largely invisible, and unfortunately not as organized as it could be, but things are changing. So Detroit, the history starts in about, for organizing in Detroit, there was a lot of organizing throughout the 90s and the 80s in local houses and communities, but real organizing happened in 2000, where the Michigan Health Department realized there was an outbreak of HIV/AIDS amongst straight Arab women. And they were very confused as to why this was happening. Because when they contacted Arab organizations, they were like, there's no such thing, A lot of ignorance was happening there. So the State Department decided, Michigan Health Department decided we're gonna recognize that there are Arab and Chaldean people on our health forms, and we're gonna include that as a checkable thing, and gave money to Access, the Arab Community Center for Economic and Social Services, to go out into the community and find out why there's an outbreak of HIV and AIDS. So they hired a straight Arab woman to go and do outreach to straight Arab women to find out why they were why there was an outbreak of HIV/AIDS. Obviously, they found 0 cases because they just didn't understand what was really going on. But then they realized, oh wait, their husbands contracted it and gave it to them by having unsafe sexual practices. So they've hired a gay Arab man, Cristiano Ramazadi, to lead a program and start doing outreach and testing. But his job wasn't easy. He encountered a lot of issues. For starts, queer Arabs didn't trust Access as an institution that would protect them as a sexual minority. Chaldeans, which do not identify as Arab, didn't trust an Arab organization that does not claim to support them. The broader Arab and Chaldean communities as a whole believed it was not an issue, HIV/AIDS was not an issue, and that homosexuality didn't exist in their communities. Religious leaders also loudly did not support their efforts and publicly denounced Access's safer sex efforts. And then queer Arabs and Chaldeans, as individually, didn't believe that HIV/AIDS was an issue and that it affected them. So we have internalized and external homophobia, ignorance, and stigma that plagued his efforts as he was trying to reach out to this community. So, and eventually he was a bit successful, but how he was able to do that in the fight against HIV and AIDS, because he realized everyone loves a party. So he put together a queer Arab party, and it was a hit. Hundreds and hundreds, and I would say about 500 Arab gay men that were never organized before showed up to a bar and started dancing. And it was after a few of these parties that he was able to grow trust within the community as a leader. And gay Arabs started to trust Access as being an organization that was there to support them and provide them with the resources. So that with Access was able to do that, but it was also just focusing on gay men, and it was only focusing on HIV and AIDS. So a group of 5 of us, gay Arab and Chaldean men, myself included, decided to create an organization. We looked at Al-Fatiha at the time as like this great Muslim organization that is incorporated, it has like these systems, and we wanted to be the Middle Eastern version of that for queer people. So we incorporated and we began working. We did outreaches. We did a lot more outreach, held a lot of parties. But unfortunately, anything beyond that was limited on its impact of reducing internalized and external homophobia, ignorance, and stigma. Women, or I should say the lack thereof, was also an issue that could be blamed on misogyny and patriarchy that resonated throughout the organization that I have to recognize I was a part of. Needless to say, I and most of the other board members ended up leaving the organization, and as it stands now, more or less just by name. There was also a lot of issues where foundations and groups with money just wanted to throw money at the organization as if all of a sudden we were going to be organized and have skills, and the organization itself didn't know how to cope with that. So Access still provides safe sex education, outreach, and testing services to gay, Arab, and Chaldean men. But the real organizing right now in Detroit actually takes place in small, little, informal collectives of people that find each other using social networking and media. So there's a lot of small women's groups, a lot of small gay men's group, but nothing that brings them all together to organize and build a community. But there's some promise coming out of these small groups. That's where Detroit is, unfortunately, right now. So in New York City, it's a little different and similar. And GLAS, the Gay and Lesbian Arab Society, launched in 1988 as an organization that wanted to combat homophobia for gay and lesbians, Arabs, and those living in Arab countries. So they want to be an international organization. Internationally, you can question some of that success, but really they were most successful in New York City. The organization was strong and managed to make many inroads within the queer Arab community in New York City, the Arab community, and the queer community. Unfortunately, the organization was plagued with many issues, which include ego, misogyny, and patriarchy again. As the organization was trying to deal with those issues and grow stronger, 9/11 happened, and all the success that they had achieved didn't mean as much because Islamophobia and anti-Arab Semitism ravaged the community. GLAS became defunct shortly thereafter. So there wasn't a lot of activity, as far as I know, other than this gay Arab party that outlived the GLAS days called Habibi, which is predominantly, again, a gay male space. Privileged gay male space. So the group of gay Arabs, men and women, found each other, Nadia being a part of that too, I wasn't there at the time, find each other organizing at the intersection of anti-Zionism and pinkwashing while looking for a community to be able to call their own. So the group formed what is now known as the Arab Queer Collective through a selective referral-only system. And the group, a few months, grew from 5 to 15 to 30 people. The group of 30 found a community to call their own, but it became quite comfortable in finding this great little community. Unfortunately, that comfort can be a challenge and can be a distraction to addressing and outreaching out to the broader community. So the group is currently challenging that comfort by intentionally growing and working to build a foundation based on a collective mission and values that drives its programs and activities and reach as many queer Arabs and Swana minorities in the area that it can. Fortunately, Zionism and pinkwashing are still huge issues that the group faces, especially when traditional LGBT institutions like the LGBT Center are not welcoming and racist. On a positive note, the organization is starting to make inroads with traditional Arab American organizations that would be an avenue for huge progress. While AQC is jumping hurdles and challenging isms, which we'll be doing for some time, I found that it was also important to make safe spaces for socialization. Again, everyone loves a party, but maybe not a gay male or dominated party. So I decided to create what's called Tarab NYC as a member of the Arab Queer Collective. And throughout my organizing work, I realized just people need a space to forget about all the homophobia, Zionism, misogyny, racism, and Islamophobia that's in their life and just go out and enjoy space with people like them, celebrating their culture in an atmosphere filled with music and dancing that they love with no fear and no regrets. And that's why Tarab NYC exists. So when organizing in Detroit and NYC, I've learned a lot. Creating a safe space is important. We need to do it. We need to do it either on a micro level, on a macro level, whatever it is. But everyone should really start small and build their base and cultivate it. I think the AQC model is really good, focusing on your core community, but avoiding marginalizing others. Look around you. I found that census data, at least more recently, is really important. If the community around you consists of Egyptians and Iraqi, but you're a group of predominantly Lebanese, then you may want to find ways to reach out and find other people. It's easy to turn into a clique. And if you're a group of men, stop. And do it. Just stop and try to make meaningful relationships with queer women and trans people that should be leading the organization in the first place. And consider religion, class, and age too. It's good to have lofty dreams, but in the case of GLASS, focus on what you do best. And meet people at where they are, and don't set expectations on people that come from a place of privilege. Not everyone is out, and not everyone wants to be out. Let them live their lives and be happy with it. And don't set an expectation that, you're a part of this gay organization, you have to be out, and this is the prescription for it. Once you have your core on what you want to do, be clear and intentional about it. Realize your community is diverse and talented, and although the organization may want to do it all, there are things that can be done by individuals or other groups that could be better. Religion is an issue, and it can be a divisive one if not handled with care. Create a secular space that respects people's belief, whatever they may be. Take baby steps and tread lightly when trying to build bridges with religious institutions. Access, when they started their Safer Sex program, was actually very smart and very strategic. They educated every single one of their staff members about what it meant to have a safer sex program, and then did a convening of religious leaders that were Shia, Sunni, and Christian. Brought them all together and got them to the point where they can say, we can support access to safer sex educational activities, which was huge for the time. And this was, I think, 2004. And you don't have to build bridges. Your work, albeit life-changing for many people, can only go so far unless the attitudes of the broader LGBT community and the Arab community changes. And people do not need to follow the nonprofit industrial complex model. There are things that work, especially for people of color organizations, that don't need to be 501c3. So there are vibrant Arab and Swana groups across this nation. I honestly believe they are coming together on their own, and they're growing. If you're not Arab and queer, what we need from you is space, and allow us to create a model that works for us, and support us through opportunities to get together as groups across the nation as we try to build strong, vibrant communities. Thank you. This thing? This one? Okay.
Hi, folks. My paper is an attempt to raise and work through some questions about the deployment of transgender representation in relation to homonationalism. It's also too long. It's also drawn from a larger project that is thinking through the relationship of critiques of queer theory in the North American context to how we think homonationalism at this moment. So what I'm going to do is lay out some of the contours of that critique of queer theory's deployment of transgender, sketch some possible applications to the homonational discourse, and then move to a case study within a case study. Mm-hmm. So the case study is, how many of you recognize this? It's a special issue of Middle East Report devoted to power and sexuality in the Middle East, circa 1998. And in many ways, it prefigures a lot of the kinds of representations that become relevant within the discourses on homonationalism and pinkwashing down the road. It involves various types of neo-Orientalist temporalities in terms of constructing the way in which trans figures might constitute atavistic forms of homosexuality or symptoms of homosexuality within a putatively primitive orient in relationship to Western modernity. And it attempts to think through honor killings in Palestine, the emergence of Dana International as a pop sensation. So lots of troubling and interesting thinking going on that's really implicated in the problems that are emerging. So I'll talk about one short essay within this as a way of excavating the function of transgender within the emergence of homonationalist discourse. But first, I'll lay out the terrain a little bit. With a few notable exceptions, there has been little discussion of the ways in which transgender subjects and discourses figure within the homonationalist moment, beyond the instructive and cautionary extensions of the critique of GLB folks' neoliberal homonormative fantasies of inclusion within the state, those offered by Hritwaran and Banji. This is not insignificant, and given the material deprivation and legal vacuum as far as transgender people's legal status and entitlements are concerned, it is certainly important to challenge trans political strategies which replicate or intensify homonormative programs and Islamophobic discourses and practices. That said, given that the theorizing of homonationalism has drawn heavily upon the theoretical resources of post-structuralism, which have significantly instrumentalized trans figures in their North American iteration, extending Western anthropological and Marxist feminist critiques of transgender as atavistic forms of gender, I think it's worth interrogating the critique of homonationalism for its relationship to queer theory as it's been articulated in the Anglo-American Academy. So a couple of reasons why this might be a fruitful area to explore this critique. Transsexual critiques have long highlighted interconnections between gender and homonormativity, masculinism, classism, racism, transphobia, and LGB consumerism. For instance, in the constitution of who gets to participate within pride parades, positive representation campaigns, human rights policy reform, and gay villages. Second, transsexual critiques have challenged the instrumentalization of trans figures within arguments around gender normativity, modernity, social construction, particularly where such instrumentalization serves queer exceptionalist political programs, which are in fact hostile to many trans people's lives and life choices. For instance, those who live their sex of identification without troubling to troubled gender, those who occupy a femme or feminine gender presentation, those who do sex work, those who identify as heterosexual. Third, and finally, these critiques have deconstructed the use of transgender metaphors to speak about race, home, and nation, often in ways that have reinforced the stability or natural status of the latter categories. As early as 1995, Marissa Swangwa refused the equation of racial and cross-gender identifications, highlighting that vectors of colonialism and racial hierarchy were not simply analogous to gender hierarchy, and further distinguishing gender oppression from transgender subject formation. More categorically, in her 1991 book, Vested Interests, literary critic Marjorie Garber proposed we understand the figure of the cross-dresser as indexing not only a crisis of categories in gender, nation, class, sex, sexuality, race, but a crisis of category itself, a crisis for the capacity to make categorical distinctions. Rightly criticizing Garber for her ahistorical and homogenizing appropriations of, pardon my new Mac, which I, really can't complain about, but the screen moves in funny ways. Homogenizing appropriations of transgender figures without regard for the oppression and marginalization ongoing transsexual, transgender, and gender variant peoples live. Vivian Namaste extends elements of Garber's analysis, as well as her own critique of the erasure of trans lives, to read the cinematic and activist uses of transgender metaphors to speak about race and nation within an implicitly US-based, queer, and culturally imperialist frame. Namaste points out both the conservative work done by such stabilizations, as well as the way in which the transgender sign remains fixed as merely figural, while constituting the real reality of race, nation, and imperial cultural norms, including those which appear oppositional and radically mobile from the point of view of an imperial or heterocentric center. Namaste and Métis sex worker and activist Mirosole Ross also contend that the realities of violence against sex workers, which disproportionately impact Aboriginal, of color, and trans women sex workers, has been obscured by a political agenda focused on transgender identity and rights on the model of GLQ organizing. Critiques made by Ross and Namaste are paralleled, echoed, anticipated, and extended by Susan Stryker, Jay Prosser, Henry Rubin, Julia Serrano, myself, Jorin Hritwaran, Dean Spade, and others, who in various ways demonstrate the violence to trans subjects affected by what Rubin, for instance, calls queer paradigmed transgenderism. queer paradigm which Haritawan reorients and problematizes through an anti-racist and transnational feminist examination of the power differentials entailed by queering up or queering down. Though not all of these authors distance themselves from queer theory as such, they all do index aporias and erasures affected by the assimilation of trans projects to normatively white Anglo-American queer theory. My own work suggests that queer theory's disfiguration of transsexualities and genders manifests effective and epistemic violence to the extent that they remain haunted by genderphobic, Eurocentric, and heteronormative striving, animating Anglo-American lesbian and gay political identity formation from the 1960s onward, a hauntology rooted in anthropological, sexological, and psychoanalytic constructions of gender variance as the bodily signifier or symptom of repressed, degenerate, or primitive same-sex desire. These critiques offer insights into the semiotic function and political economy of transgender representation, which can be brought into dialogue with critiques of homonationalist and pinkwashing discourses. And we can talk about this in relationship to the representation of transsexuals in Iran in films like Be Like Others. I know there was discussion of this morning. One can think about it in relationship to the ways in which the presence of trans prostitutes on the urban landscape in Istanbul are contrasted to an Ottoman legacy of same-sex desire within Turkic gay male communities. There are a variety of ways in which these temporalities play out. I'm going to turn to Dana International. And this is me tracking time. I mentioned that I would be using a case study from within this issue of Middle East Report. In this issue, within the concentration on power and sexuality in the Middle East, Ashkenazi lesbian feminist Yael Ben-Tzvai's Zionist lesbianism and transsexual transgression, two representations of queer Israel, give a kind of paradigm case for the problematic I'm describing. Ben-Tzvai's piece offers early documentation and critique of those tendencies we now identify as pinkwashing and homonationalism. Quote, "The same Supreme Court that shows little concern for Palestinian or Mizrahi appeals for social justice has been consistently gay-friendly. This is due to the ways in which official representatives of Israeli queers have imagined and positioned their community to conform to the ideological contours that shape Ashkenazi Zionist imaginings of Israel. Like transsexuals in the urban landscape in Istanbul, another essay in this issue of Middle East Report, this essay offers critiques made via contrasting temporal and teleological spatializations. The article compares two figures, Michael Eden, a Mizrahi candidate in Tel Aviv municipal elections, representing both CLAF, the lesbian feminist community, and Meretz, the left Zionist party, and Dana International, then recently selected by the Israeli Broadcasting Corporation to represent the country in the Eurovision Song Competition. Though both are framed as queer, in the contrast, Eden's lesbian feminism and Zionism mark her as belonging to an earlier moment, one amenable to policing the boundaries of the category woman, equality seeking within the state of Israel, and unconcerned with the occupation, effectively transphobic and homonormative, and pro-Zion. In contrast, Dana International is celebrated for her transgressive signification as a transsexual performing hyperbolic, almost deconstructive femininity, as a Yemeni Jew, as a singer whose musical productions are linguistically, musically, and racially hybrid. Dana is also celebrated for denunciation of homophobic statements by Israel's then president, Ezer Weizmann. Yael Ben-Tzvai's article recognizes the instrumentalization of Dana's visible diversity by the Israeli state, but still attaches to her queerly configured trans identity the ability to violate nationalist and homonormative frames, as well as subversively queer, sentimental, sexist, racist, and heterocentric national myths of heroic Ashkenazi men taming a feminized Orient. For Ben-Tzvai, Dana's transgressiveness seems guaranteed by her emblematic status as a Mizrahite. Transsexual metonymic fallacy, I would argue, is secured through recourse to the American queer scene, a recapitulation of the teleological narrative of progress from lesbian separatism to an expansive, gender-destabilizing queer theory. An Anglo-American telos, which may offer for critique a critique of assimilation and LGBT rights activism, but which rhetorically constructs liberatory queerness, including transliberation, primarily in reference to this movement of modernization through destabilization of identity markers. If we want to consider what might be insufficient about this in empirical rather than theoretical terms, we might turn to the announcement of the first ever Jerusalem Pride celebration in 2002. Pride triumphed over prejudice in West Jerusalem yesterday when a divided city renowned for religious conservatism saw the first gay parade in its long and tortured history. The article goes on to nominate Dana International's representation of Israel as a landmark in the movement of equality for Israeli queers. The article goes on to situate Eurovision in this way. And finally, we might turn to a more recent moment. After the Israeli commando attack upon the Turkish Gaza-breaking ship Mavi Marmara, Dana International's gigs in Turkey and Spain were cancelled. Dana responded by signaling her allegiance with the Israeli state by wearing an IDF t-shirt on television and announcing her allegiance with the Israeli state. So my point here is merely that the signifiers of destabilization, of identity, of queerness, of fluidity, of hybridity, which in some ways mark Dana as a hopeful figure in one moment, become repurposed over the course of the movement towards queer citizenship within Israel and a kind of domesticated notion of hybridity that I think is not unimportant to our consideration of how homonormativities and become homonationalism and how transnormativities might be articulated within racialized registers of the state. If I've got one more minute, I will conclude by implicating myself in all of this with poems written in 2002 in a more hopeful and complicit moment. Ghazals for Sharon Cohen, Dana International. In the defiles, a Jew, or an assemblage of signs, a detour, landing her parents in the camps. Neither sexed nor given to Arabic in the home. Can you believe it? In Israel, of Israel. In Palestine, we know 400 villages ceased for that in the beginning. Do you dream of Yemen, Dana, as I dream of Lebanon? In Europe, they praise you, diva. Jews have not always fared so well. Sharon is singing between two languages, three. In your second sex, improvised mother tongue, they say you corrupt the youth of Cairo, that you collaborate with Mossad. At home, Likud and Shaz denounce you. Home is burnt sand, disappearance in light. Later, your songs are banned in Germany. They say Arabs and Turks are the new Jews. In a feminine voice, the hazard of presence. In your house, is there shelter in Palestine? And I'll end there. Thanks.
Thank you, Nadia, Bashar, and Trish, for helping us start a conversation on the queer and trans Arab imaginary, how it operates at the psychic, literary, material, and theoretical levels. And I'm going to open the floor for questions and discussion from the audiences.
I have a question for Nadia. And I know Jenny Kelly's going to be paper on this tomorrow, but from your experience, is it possible to have delegations without colonialism? And to what extent can they still be valuable, even with that component?
I think it's possible to have delegations without colonialism, actually, in spite of everything that might seem contrary to that. Just looking back at Palestine's history, the first delegation to Palestine, which consisted of members from delegates from Europe, from Iran, were brought by wealthy Jerusalem families to shore up scientific evidence in favor of their sort of land, preservation of their land, of their territory, and ultimately this delegation partitioned the country. So, you can't really extricate delegations or internationals from Palestine, but I think having spoken with Jenny Kelly, who's a researcher who does work around this, and my own observations and experiences, I think being a delegate to a place that's suffering from apartheid and is under occupation comes with a lot of personal responsibility, and I think that you really need to do a lot of decolonization work on yourself before you can go there, and go there with a level of humility, and that's really important. And I think that what that task looks like needs to be defined in partnership with the people who have invited you. I know there was a Women of Color delegation of which Angela Davis, I believe, was a part, and this, Angela Davis has had decades of experience working as an activist. She went to prison. She was part of Black radical movements, and yet her experience in Palestine and her engagement with human rights workers there was so profound that, she mentions it anytime she comments on the situation there, and I think that's really significant. So that's what I would say. I think it is possible. I don't think that. I think it's a process of doing preliminary work before you enter the space. I really do.
Bashar, thanks, and thanks to the whole panel for everything. I was wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit about what good, in your experience, what good HIV work or what effective HIV work does look like in the communities that you were a part of?
So in Detroit, we had to go to the people where they were. So it was the bars. It was so the bars, the bathhouses, the parks, wherever we could find people. And the biggest thing that made the work effective in Detroit was building relationships. And there's one counselor in particular that's still been at Access since the creation of the program that everyone knows and trusts. They can just go to his office. They feel like they can they build a relationship with him. I think building that trust is the biggest thing, especially when you're an Arab organization that doesn't necessarily have a track record of helping gay people out. Trust is the largest thing, and meeting people where they are. An empowerment program was tried in Detroit, and it didn't fare too well. So I think it's just meeting people at where they're at and building that trust is really what was successful in Detroit.
What builds the trust?
It's the people. They hired non-Arabs at first to staff the program, and that wouldn't work. So I think it's really putting people in positions from the same community is very important. The same could be said for the Latino community and other people of color, but that's the basis of it.
Oh yeah, I was just curious about following up to the first question. I was reminded when I went on the Venceremos Brigade to Cuba, which is slightly different than a delegation, but we went through sort of like, as I recall, a 2 or 3 month process of study and work in the community before we went. So I hadn't remembered that, and I'm not sure actually how useful it was, but they made an attempt. So I'm curious, what kind of preparation did you all do before you went?
Well, a couple things about that. First, some of the tour leaders made an effort to connect with people who are about to embark on this trip, and give them certain reading materials, this sort of thing, just have a conversation a little briefly about what to expect entering the country. We had people who were not politically aligned on this delegation, and we had people who had very diverse experiences with international travel, let alone international travel into a zone that is, under occupation, right? So what I would have loved is for everyone to have met each other before embarking on this trip and really just sat down and got a sense of, what your vulnerabilities are, what are your limitations, what are your, what do you think might be challenging about this trip, and not assume because you have a certain mastery over the history of a region or a certain mastery over, say, the discourse of BDS, that you're culturally competent or emotionally competent to really engage in the work that I know Palestinians need done. So,
Can I just add something on the delegation, because I was on a delegation that overlapped with the one that you were part of. The U.S. campaign for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel, and we had a very small group. It was 5 of us, and 2 out of the 3, all of us were already committed to this political issue before going there, so we weren't going there to learn about it in order to figure out if we were going to be in solidarity. And 2 out of 3 of us were already on the advisory board for U.S. ACB, and part of the selection in terms of thinking it through was to get it to support U.S. ACB, knowing that if people who are part of the organizing team had already been there and are speaking about it to actually raise awareness of the campaign here, that there was actually a pretty specific sort of focus, which was to be able to bear witness, not to become new authorities, but to actually talk about it in relation to BDS and in relation to responding to the call from PACB. And so we went and we met with PACB and we had that. But the other part of it is that all the scholars that went work on liberation and decolonization struggles in other areas of the world. So for us, it was always already about cross-solidarity with the struggles of the people whom we're either affiliated with through struggle and through political activism, as well as our research and home communities. So I think already doing pre-existing or colonial work or decolonization work made for a really different dynamic, because we were also making those connections when we presented our work with people there. So Nefertiti Tadiar talked about decolonization politics in the Philippines in relation to what's going on in Palestine, and also in relation to global capital in the Middle East and Filipino domestic workers in Israel, Palestine, and in occupied territories specifically. So a lot of kind of cross work that I think has potential, and we're still sort of seeing some of the fruits of that, the potentials for that.
but you had a collective project, right? So this particular delegation, my understanding of the intentions were that the delegates were going to get a sense of what the kind of organizing Palestinian queer organizations are doing, but also to get a broader view from meeting with villagers, meeting with olive farmers, meeting with people living in refugee camps, of what does apartheid look like in all these different spaces. And it was a very short trip. It was 1 week, and the way it was organized kind of was quite grueling, I must say, because we were driving from place to place to place, and there were like a lot of human needs that weren't kind of built into the schedule. And I think that, the lack of having a central organizing project that was understood by everyone, coupled with the kind of difficulty of the trip, I think made it more challenging than it needed to be. And then also, I have to, say that when I went there and I brought 2 North Americans, and then I had the rest of our Palestinian film crew, my assumption was that we were going to be on Palestine time a little bit. Even though it's a week, that we were going to maybe be seeing things in the morning, maybe from like 8 to 1, and then in the afternoon downtime, some breathing room, and that wasn't the case. So I think my own presence there made things more difficult, and so it was a unique but challenging trip. So.
Trish, I'm provoked by what I understood to be the concern of trans becoming the new gay. The possible expansion into lifestyleism that so much of this conference is about discussing. And I'm wondering what kind of gathering or event or community action that a community like this could participate in that would heighten awareness or try to create alternatives or articulate some of the alternatives to the concerns that you're raising?
Well, I certainly think there are ways in which emergent trans political formations can participate within the kinds of moves that homonormative politics have given rise to. It's less that I'm concerned about trans becoming the new gay, as I believe there is a mistake made when one moves trans into a queer theoretical frame for understanding the political. And I believe that mistake elides distinctions in political interests, social location. And so the way in which trans can become the new gay is those trans people whose politics are best served by trans becoming the new gay can make it that way, right? So I think what we need is actually a more heterogeneous conception of how trans people live. And I don't have an easy answer as to how one deinstitutionalizes the process of identity formation that's already gone on. Some propositions that have been made, programs of decriminalizing sex work rather than playing into the military prison industrial complex through articulating a need for hate crime law and human rights protection. Emphasizing healthcare as a universal. Here I am being, a nostalgic Canadian for when we had healthcare as a universal, which we don't anymore, and we never really did. But so I guess addressing social condition in our social justice work rather than identity as a locus, and thinking about how easy it is to slide from a certain kind of theoretical calculus of inclusion to a nomination of practical politics from one milieu into another. So, these are moves about interrupting our own tendency to get things done, because getting things done sometimes gets the wrong things done. That's all.
I just want to follow up on that. I think I really appreciate what you shared too, and the idea that I think it's been problematic, the idea that trans is naturally or essentially something radical. I think we see undermined, and I've been noticing this because I've been hearing this from maybe other people have heard that the next the next thing the big national gay organizations like HRC are going to work on in the U.S. is trans military service.
Woohoo!
The thing we most need because it's a really bad job. And when I went on this delegation and talked to trans people. Talk to some trans Israeli people about this narrative in Israel that if you go into the military, you'll get your healthcare needs met, which is really interesting to me to think about this dynamic of trans healthcare needs are met through things getting into the military, and here in New York State, trans healthcare isn't covered by our Medicaid program for low-income people, but according to the law, that's not really delivered. It is delivered for prisoners. So you see all these moments in which trans people, it's not really, but just watching even within the law, the ways that your healthcare needs are more accessible and the more locked down, militarized spaces, and also kind of the growing palatability of transness and services representations that have happened really fast in the last 10 years in the U.S. that leads groups like HRC to think about a trans military bid. And I just, the kind of levels of it's interesting even trying to write about this in around the U.S. and Israel and like this kind of trans framework because of trans having military inclusion there. I mean, all of these pieces, and I appreciate your work on this really disjointed, but I just saw this. I kept thinking about that HRCC thing as you were talking, and the necessity of letting go of the notion that trans politics has to do with disruption.
Thank you.
I just want to say, I'm just going to be blunt. I took a lot of comp lit when I was in undergrad, and I was really struggling in the beginning of your talk to imagine what you were what you were talking about, to follow the language. No, and then when you got to the description of Donna International, it was like this movie in my mind, and I felt like you really made something very concrete for me that I hadn't imagined before, and I was just thinking of it in terms of pinkwashing related media, because there's a party that's hosted in Tel Aviv, a gay party, or the Arisa party, and they have these videos that they send all over the place. And a couple of them include like a drag performance, but it's like over like a Mizrahi sort of song, and then usually results in some violence against the drag performer, and I don't know, maybe that would be useful to your work, seeing these videos, because it's so problematic and so offensive, and yet this is used as a tool to bring predominantly affluent European gay male tourists to Tel Aviv, and it's something that's sort of like showcasing the multiple minorities that constitute Israel, while reproducing this like hierarchy, sexual hierarchies, gender hierarchies, etc. So I thought about that afterwards, and I enjoyed what you had to say.
Thanks so much.
I think we are. So thank you all the panelists and the audience.